So you'll notice where I've connected this particular pump, we've got a A-type coupling as well as the nylon garden fittings as well to accommodate the securing of the hose. But always we still use our safety clips to ensure that it can't come undone. If I had a bigger or larger water supply hose, you'll find that the use of plastic fittings is diminished, and we would normally screw them straight into a steel tail or a hose tail with a clamp, primarily because there's more pressure behind a larger hose and it increases the volume of water. So it's important that you read the description and safety instructions in relation to these particular pumps, because sometimes they might say you need a 1/2 inch and not 1/4 inch hose. You might need a 3/4 instead of a 1/2 inch hose, and so forth. So if you read the instructions prior to utilising this equipment, it does two things. One, it ensures the longevity of the pump, but two, and more importantly, it ensures your safety as an operator in utilising this type of equipment. Whilst we look at it and say, well, it's only a water blaster, it still has the capacity to inject me with water. So even the low pressure water cleaners that you see at the car wash and so forth, if you're close enough to the nozzles that are utilised with those particular pieces of equipment, they still have the capacity to inject you. So this is no different. The other aspect of this, of course, is how many litres a minute it does. So in relation to how many litres a minute it does, these working parts here get quite warm. This is why we have a cage around this to eliminate people putting their hands on it, resting their body parts on there. This is no different to any other piece of equipment. There is standard safety equipment that's needed in relation to its operation. It's noisy, so you probably need earplugs. Well, there's no problem, you can use earplugs, earmuffs. You would need a visor, some safety glasses, and the most important thing is you would need protective clothing, gum boots, steel cap boots, and gloves. But as far as water injection is concerned, there isn't a glove that's going to save you from a water injection from a nozzle. Even as something is similar to this machine, which is 4,000 psi, it still has the capacity to penetrate any fabric you put on your hands, gloves, rubber, whatever, to inject you with water. So in that regard, as far as these are concerned, you'll notice the lance is a certain length on these. Well, that's to make it comply with standards. The standard is the length of this lance has to be at least 1200. Why do they make it a certain length? Well, if it was short, can you imagine the ability to be able to point it at myself? So the whole idea of this, you can see the handle's here and the end of the nozzle is up here. So you see, I can't physically shoot myself with it, but what you can do if you're not careful is run it across your feet. So that's why we wear steel cap gumboots or steel cap boots. And you can get a spat that goes over your boot as well if you're concerned about it. So there's a shoe cover or boot that's aluminium that can protect you in that regard too, particularly if you're looking at doing drains that are close to near your feet. But common sense prevails. If I'm going to work an area near my feet, of course, I'll step back, take a stance so I don't fall over, pull the trigger and work away from myself, not toward myself. So the lance is designed in such a way that I can't shoot myself. But the triggers on these particular guns, on all water jetting, water cleaning equipment, they're what we call a hold to activate device. So they have a safety. As you can see, the safety normally drops down to eliminate the depression of the trigger. But if I clip that back up out of the way, I can now depress the trigger. But if I let the trigger go, it stops. That's what we call a hold to activate. So I have to hang on to that to activate the nozzle. Now, having said that, the one aspect of any water cleaning unit that'll undermine its integrity and deem it unsafe as well is an act called triggering. So once I start water blasting, it's important that I depress the trigger and maintain depression to do the job. So what I'm saying is you don't look at a job and say, okay, then I'll give it a squirt, depress the trigger, because for every action you have here, there's a reaction down here with the pump itself. So the triggering that I mentioned is something that you don't find as a habit, triggering, because every time I let this go, the pressure that's in this line that stops at the gun here has to go somewhere. So I build up pressure, and by letting the trigger go, the pressure is still maintained and built up in here. It has to go somewhere. So in these particular units, we have what we call an unloader valve. So the unloader valve, what it does is when the pressure builds up around the maximum pressure of the pump, it'll start to dump the pressure. So the unloader valve, every time you pull that trigger, it's spring loaded. So it comes home and allows you to maintain pressure. When you let the trigger go, the unloader valve will wait until it builds up sufficient pressure, and then it'll start lifting off the seat. So it's held by a spring on the seat. So every time you let the trigger go, the pressure will build up in the pump, then the unloader valve comes into action and starts unloading the pressure, so that you don't have an increment of pressure to the stage where it's detrimental to the pump and it explodes. That's what an unloader valve is designed to do. So if you trigger this particular unit, the pump itself is trying to unload, and you're wearing it out prematurely. So what I suggest you do is arrange yourself to do the job, walk up to the job, pull the trigger, and hold the trigger on to complete the work without triggering on and off, on and off, on and off. And that's indicative to all water blasters, not just small ones, also, and more so, high pressure units up to 40,000 PSI. So when I say you have to depress the trigger and hold it on as long as possible, well, of course, if you have to stop and move, there's nothing wrong with letting the trigger go, moving, or if there's an incident or you can see a potential hazard occurring, of course, let the trigger go. But then you need to come back to the pump and release the pressure or turn the machine off. So on all of these machines, there's the capacity to increase the pressure or decrease the pressure. Now with most of these type water blasters, there's a small cap that covers a pressure gauge. It's mandatory that they have a pressure gauge on them. Most of them are what we call liquid filled. So they've got glycol in them with a glass front. That's why the cover's on there. Now the glycol is put into the gauge to hold the needle still. So because it's liquid filled, it assists in holding a secure reading from the needle. So say for example it wasn't liquid filled, the needle would fibrillate to such a degree that I couldn't read what it was telling me. So they liquid fill these for that reason. So if the liquid runs out or this glass is damaged, you need to replace it. The other aspect of it, of course, is it's got a venturi entry in the back of it where the water pressure builds up and comes through into this chamber. So if you lose that glycol, break the glass, damage the gauge, there's a consequence for that too, because the water has got somewhere to escape and will eventually push all the glycol out of this, and you can't read what it's doing. So if you damage this gauge, what I am saying is you need to replace it immediately. So the cover's on there for a reason. Will I leave the cover on there all the time? Of course not. If I'm trying to establish a pressure, remove the cover and you'll increase the pressure gauge to establish what pressure you're after in relation to or what's consistent with the job requirement. So the cover's there for a reason. So what else do I need to know about this here? We've got 3 valves, 3 pistons, and what we call an oscillating cam in there, which I can show you with a cutout. And the cutout is indicative to what's inside this pump. So because this one's not cut out, everything's sealed, of course. So the important thing is there is maintenance involved with these machines, such as checking oils, and that is oil to this pump. And there is a specific viscosity of oil that you use